Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Framework Podcast. I'm your host as normal, Jamie Hopkins here. And today I'm excited to have somebody join the show who I just got to meet really recently, came through a mutual connection of ours. But I see all your great work on TV and out there in the media. I know you sent me one of them here today too. But Dr. Anthony Chan, really excited to have you on and kind of hear a little bit more about your story. So thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll start with the quick kind of 20 seconds about you, and we'll dive into your story, so you don't have to do it all in 20 seconds. But can you just give the audience the kind of who you are and, you know, the elevator pitch version, right? You say, hey, how are you doing? And then we'll kind of get into some of the other deeper level questions.
Well, Jamie, economics was always a big passion for me. I grew up in the inner cities, low-income public housing, but even back then, I knew economics was something that I wanted to pursue, and I decided that when I was at a young age of about 13 years old, and I never really looked back, and I think it served me pretty well during my career.
Very nice. And, so I've got two icebreaker questions I typically kick off with. The first one is more or less just about food. So this is the fun one, and I just tried to come up with something that everyone needs to be able to answer, right? So everyone eats, so that's a good starting point. But when I bring up food, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Well, like, you know, favorite food, your last dish that you would eat, or favorite type of cuisine, whatever it is that pops to your mind.
Sushi pops to my mind. It's always been my favorite cuisine. I've enjoyed all my trips to Japan to really eat the authentic food there. But I have good news for you, Jamie. You can find good sushi here in the United States and almost in every single state of the United States. So it's a food that I love, and I'm happy to say that almost anywhere I go, I can get to enjoy it.
It is true. I don't know if it's been true our whole lives, right? But at least now, you know, I go out to Omaha, Nebraska a lot, and they have pretty good sushi there too. I mean, I don't know if it's as good as you know, New York and Philadelphia, but it's pretty good, and I love sushi. So I had sushi last week, and funny enough, my 4, 3, and 2-year-olds, all three of them eat sushi. So it's the next generation has now been in the
great.
sushi world too. Have you had a sushi experience though that you thought was just your favorite? I mean, whether it was with family, friends, a work thing in Japan, is there a memory that sticks out about that?
I think the memory that sticks out in my mind is certainly an experience that I had in Japan, where they presumably had this big sushi chef, and one of the clients in a trip that I took insisted that I go to one of these restaurants, and the service was something that I will never forget.
Yeah, it was like that. Just the service and the treatment was just kind of special.
Yes, the service was special. The ordering of the food and which pieces the chef thought were important for us to take, and making sure they all complemented each other was really a first-class experience. And it was not about price. It was about the quality of the experience, and that's what made it very special.
Awesome. Well, I'll shift over to the other kind of intro question I often bring in, which is, what was your first experience with money, right? So you kind of brought up some of your childhood, but do you have a first experience you can remember that comes to mind, positive, negative, right, trauma, whatever it might be? What was your first experience going back with money?
Well, Jamie, for me, managing wealth was always very important because I grew up in a low-income with a low-income background. My mother finished the 3rd grade, and that was it. My father, I think, was a little bit more ambitious, and he went up to the 4th grade. So growing up, I really had to find ways to be able to make money because there was not a lot of money in my household. So my first experience was selling newspapers, and I was about 10 years old. And I remember bringing home $1.50 on my first day, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And I made sure that I managed that money so that it lasted me over a month. And I was very, very careful as to how I would spend it and what things gave me the maximum satisfaction for my expenditures. We know that economists now say that when you buy things, you have to make sure that the marginal utility of every product is equal to each other to make sure you maximize or optimize your consumer utility. And even though I had no idea what that meant at the age of 10, I think I was doing it.
Yeah. So what was the first purchase then? What did you spend that $1.50 on over the course of a month? Do you remember anything?
Well, yes, I do. I actually did not spend the entire amount. I had a favorite toothpaste that I like, and I still remember till this day that I went to the supermarket and bought Crest toothpaste. I'm not trying to make a commercial for Crest, but it was something that I liked, and nobody else in my household liked it. But I had gone to a friend's house, and I tried it, and I just thought it was so good, and I wanted to have it. And my mom said, you have to use the one that everybody else uses in the household. But I went ahead and bought myself a very small tube. And I still remember, I think it was something like 49 cents. And I bought that and I made sure that it lasted almost 3 months because I used it very sparingly.
That's a great story. I love that one. And yeah, you're like not doing a commercial, but you almost, it's a pretty good one. So, tell me a little bit more then about your childhood and how you grew up. I mean, obviously, and where did you grow up?
I grew up in New York City in public housing projects. I lived in several of them in Astoria, Queens. I lived in Harlem, and I also lived in Manhattan, the Upper West Side, and then I also lived in East New York. Very rough neighborhoods, gang-infested neighborhoods. But certainly, we didn't know any better. We thought that was normal, and we just tried to make the best that we could, given those circumstances. As I mentioned before, I started selling newspapers at the age of 10, but that didn't stop there. In fact, my first official job after selling newspapers and doing other things like errands for people around the neighborhood was working as a cook for Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I started that job when I was 14. I have to, full disclosure, I had to tell them that I was 16 because I needed the money. My dad passed away when I was 10 years old. And so money was very, very difficult to get. So I had to do something in order to be able to help my mother, who was living on Social Security, widow's benefits. And it certainly wasn't enough to be able to get us by. So I always had a part-time job of some sort. During the summers, my mother worked not only as a cleaning office person, but she also, during the summer, took on extra jobs as a waitress, and I often went and helped her, and sometimes I used to get tips. So I always worked, but in Kentucky Fried Chicken at the age of 14, I worked. And I worked in a real challenging neighborhood where there was a lot of drugs in the neighborhood, and I had to sort of survive. And I didn't want to do it because I saw a lot of the kids in my neighborhood that simply overdosed, passed away, and I had to find a way to be able to avoid that. But again, peer pressure was very, very strong. But there was one good news aspect of my job, and that is there was a 50-pound box of pure lard that had to be put in a fryer. And at the age of 14, I really wasn't strong enough to lift the 50 pounds. So I always would just struggle and then just throw it in there. And the oil that was boiling would always pop up and it would burn my arms, sometimes even my legs. And so when I walked around the neighborhood, people saw my arms and they thought they were heroin needle marks. And so nobody bothered me. They said, oh, he's pretty cool. Look at his arms. He does shoot up heroin. And so I never was I would say bullied or encouraged to take drugs because they just assumed I did. And so I was able to go to school and do everything. And whenever anybody bothered me about drugs, they just looked at my arms and they walked away.
It's it's a pretty amazing way that you reframed that into a positive, right? I mean, I thought that was beautifully done. And but really how challenging that is for a 14-year-old, right? I mean, you're getting burned by hot oil at your job and viewing that as a positive because you're not getting pressured into drug use because people are thinking that you're, shooting up. And, Yeah, I mean that's it's a challenging place to be, but obviously you take it in a very positive light. I mean, have you always been this positive too since a kid? Like, do you look at the positives and everything?
Yes, absolutely. That is the only way to survive. To always be positive when there's negative around you. I've done that since I was a little kid. As I said, my dad passed away at the age of 10. He would pick me up from school every single day, and one day he didn't pick me up, and I came home, and he had died from an aneurysm, and I found him
Mm.
dead at the age of 10 when I came into the house. And the positive thing is that I came to the realization that I didn't have to worry about growing up. I said the day my dad passed away, there was the day that I became an adult. It
Yeah.
was just me and my mom, and I never looked back. And I always made decisions. And whenever I made those decisions, I would tell my mom, I have to make a decision as a child and as an adult at the same time. And that meant that I had to think about the future, not just the now and then. And so I turned that big negative, which would have scarred some children at the age of 10, into a very strong positive. And every time I made a decision, I would always ask myself, is this a decision that I want to make that will have implications for the next 10 or 15 years? Because that's the way adults think, and that's the way I have to make these decisions.
So obviously you took that, as you said, turned it to a positive. You also, you worked. You obviously focused on school too, because you went on, but to do kind of very well on that side. And so how did you balance that? I mean, were you naturally gifted at school? Did you have to push yourself hard? I mean, what was school like for you, and what did when you were making those decisions, what did you think you were going to be, right? Like in high school, did you say, hey, I really want to do X, Y, or Z living in New York? Did you have a vision of what you wanted to do career wise?
Well, career-wise, I was about 13 years old, and I turned on the television one day, and Bill Simon, who was the Treasury Secretary under Jimmy Carter, was on television, and he, of course, was the economic spokesperson, or you can say like the economist for the administration. He was talking about supply and demand curves, and I was just so fascinated by the conversation. And I just said right then and there that that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. It was to be an economist, and as I said, I never looked back. With regard to school, because I grew up in a very challenging neighborhood where you could make the argument that maybe the schools were not as good. I worked really hard, and so did my mother, making very subsistence level wages so that I could go to parochial school. And by at that time, tuition was $5 a month. So all we had to do was to work really, really hard and raise $60 a year and put that money aside so that I could go to parochial school and be able to get a decent level of education. And so that's what I did during elementary school. For high school, the tuition went up not from $60 to $500, and there was no way I could do that. So I went to public high school. I went to Canarsie High School in Brooklyn, which, by the way, at the time was not a bad school. I mean, we had some really fascinating people graduate from that school. Of course, Howard Schultz, who owned Starbucks, he did pretty good. He was a graduate. He graduated 1 year before me, and there were others. I mean, the person that's running for mayor of New York City, Curtis Silwa, was in many of my classes. In fact, he asked me to join a gang, and I said, no, I've been struggling to avoid that, so I'm not going to join your gang. But he said, it's a great gang. We just have good things. And I said, you're probably right, but I'm not going to take the risk. Again, I was trying to be risk averse in that sense. Looking back, he did something honorable, and maybe I should have joined, but I didn't. And of course, I would always bump into people like Howard Schultz in the university. He was always talking about creating some sort of a coffee store, and people would laugh and say, "There's a coffee shop across the street. Is that what you mean?" And of course, no, he had greater ambitions. And so, one of the things I learned is that you never ever ridicule anybody's dream, because it might just come through. And that's something that I learned early on by seeing the passion in all these people, whether it be Curtis Silwa, whether it be Howard Schultz, or be others. We had others there. We had people that became professional athletes that graduated from our school. And again, they all had dreams. And so that's one thing that nobody can ever take away from you. And that's something that I instill in all the students that I have mentored over the years. And again, I have mentored many people during my career, and the biggest gift I can give them is once you find your passion and your dream, never let go, because that's the only thing that will get you to the next level.
So you obviously, I love that. Did you still ever get to run into Howard, or as Starbucks started to get created, did you ever talk to him about, hey, I remember when you used to talk about this idea?
I have not, but I have bumped into Curtis Silwa, who's running for mayor on the Republican ticket in New York City.
Yeah.
But not Howard Schultz or others. The school, of course, was closed. But one of the things that I never forget is that Howard Schultz, every year after he made it, would send a check to Canarsie High School to the football team and tell them, you write the amount that you need to make sure that football team survives. And that's something that I have so much respect for people that have done that, that do things like that, because it is something that allows people to see that when you succeed, you can give back. And that's something that I've always tried to do, is give back to society, whether it be by mentoring or now as a treasurer of the Skyhook Foundation, which has been around for a long time, but is now headed by the great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the great basketball player of all times, that basically supports a lot of low-income children in order to go into the stem cell world at a very low cost. And that is something that right now they're doing it in California, but they have ambitions to go national. And everywhere I go, if there is corporations or organizations that want to make a difference and try to close the income inequality gap, that's certainly one way to do it.
Wow. Well, I think we'll try to get back to that one too, because that sounds really interesting. And my job is to keep us moving through the story in some line. But so we'll skip probably some things. But you ended up, going through college and then eventually getting your PhD at University of Maryland. Is that correct? Terrapin World, right?
No, that's right. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, the first person in my family to get a master's degree, and of course, the first person in my family to get a PhD. And a lot of the people in my family just thought it was a little strange that I kept going to school. Some, in fact, accused me of just being lazy and not wanting to work. So that's why I just stayed in school so long. But the reality was that my goal was to follow my passion. And so I wanted to do economics. And I learned early on that if you really want to understand the profession, you have to get a master's, you have to get a PhD to really fully understand it and really work in that profession. And then so that was my goal. It was not about making money, Jamie, because when I went to college, my professor, I had a couple of professors, and one of the professors told me, you shouldn't get a PhD in economics. You should get a PhD in finance because they make about $15,000 more than economic professors. And I said, that's an interesting fact, but then I wouldn't be following my passion. I like finance, but that's not something that I want to focus on exclusively. It is economics. So I will take the profession that pays a little bit less, but nonetheless will give me some internal satisfaction. And then I'll worry about the money later. And that worked out very well.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of, that's always an interesting thing, right? When somebody's say, well, you could go over here and make more money, but if your heart's not in it, you might not make it in that world too, right? And I think that's one of the things, right? That your passion is allows you probably to succeed in some areas more so than others. So tell us a little bit about, so you leave school. Tell us a little bit about what was the first job out of, kind of school, like real career job? Where did you start off?
Well, there were many jobs along the way, but right after I graduated from my graduate studies, I had done an internship with the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C., where they basically financed my graduate studies. It's a funny story behind that, Jamie. I always wanted to work at the Federal Reserve, and so I just decided to write a letter to the Federal Reserve in Washington and tell them that I was fascinated with monetary policy, and I gave them an idea of what I would work on for a PhD dissertation topic. And they called me up and they told me to to fill out some paperwork and maybe apply for a fellowship, and I did, and I got the fellowship, and so I got to work on my PhD, and they helped me with it, and I also got to spend 2 years at the Federal Reserve in Washington. Got to go to a lot of the meetings, got to know Paul Volcker very well. In fact, he took me under his wing and would invite me to a lot of meetings. And he said, if you stick around with me, you'll learn something about monetary policy. And so I even got to go to some of the policy meetings, which to me was very fascinating. But the first real job, that was kind of a fellowship job, not a real job. But the first real job is that I wanted to do research. And so I went and applied to universities all over the United States. And of course, because the economics profession doesn't pay well, I told my family, I had a child at the time, I had a daughter, and I was married. I said, I will take the job that pays the highest salary. And again, it was a very modest salary, but I took a job in the Midwest of a university that paid the highest wage, and I stayed there for about 3 years. I did a lot of research while I was there. In fact, the professors there on average taught 9 hours a week, but because I was publishing and doing research, they gave me a research grant. So I only had to teach 6 hours a week or 2 classes and get a research grant that would cover the other course out there and just give me an opportunity to do research. And I loved it. I loved it tremendously. And you needed to publish 3 articles in 5 years in order to get tenure. But I had 5 articles published after about 2.5 years. So I was guaranteed to get tenure. But I wanted to publish in better and better journals. So I wrote a letter to the New York Federal Reserve and told them, I'm working on this research piece, and it's on monetary policy. I'd love for you to tell me what it's all about and give me some feedback. And they said, why don't you come on down? I said, no, I'm an assistant professor. I don't really have money to fly to New York and stay in a hotel because the little money that I make is to support my family. I said, oh, no, we have plenty of money. We'll have you, we'll sponsor you. And so I went to the New York Fed, even though I was born and raised in New York City, but I was living in the Midwest. And I presented my paper, and then a week later, 2 weeks later, no response. So I called them up and I said, I need the feedback because I want to submit it to a journal. And they said, oh, we were about to call you up. We're going to make you a job offer. And I said, no. I'm happy being a professor. I just want to do monetary policy. I want to continue to do this. And they said, no, you should consider it. And so I talked to them a little bit, and they made me a job offer, and it was twice the salary of my professorship. At one point, I wasn't going to take it, but I told my wife, and she said, if you don't take the job, we're getting a divorce. So I took the job. I'm sure she was joking, but I took the job, and I stayed there for about 3 years. And then I got a call from an executive recruiter to basically go and work for Wall Street on a fixed income trading floor. And I said, well, I'm actually pretty happy here at the Fed because even though my first dream was to continue to do research in economics and follow my passion, they're allowing me to do research here in addition to policy work. And they said yes, but they offered me a 50% increase in salary. So I said, well, I guess I could do it for a few years and then go back. So I did. I worked there for about 2.5 years. And then I got a call from an executive recruiter that JPMorgan was looking for an economist, a chief economist, to head one of their fixed income groups. And I basically didn't know whether I wanted to do that, but I figured why not? I took the job. And again, that was about a 50% increase in salary over the previous one. So I took it. And somehow everything worked out so well. I stayed there for a few years, 25 to be exact. When I joined, I was so happy that I would always tell people in my around me, I would say, this is a great job. I think I want to do this for about 25 years. And they laughed because it was only after year one. But yeah, I actually retired 25 years later in 2019, the same month that I joined 25 years later, just as I said 1 year after joining.
Wow, that's awesome. And yeah, I mean, those are some amazing people you got to be around and work, along. There was Volcker and then obviously Jamie Dimon there at JPMorgan. And so you went through obviously a lot of really interesting times at JPMorgan, right? I mean, financial crisis time period, right, would have been a big thing. I guess you went through the merger then too, right? That would have been back then.
Yes, and, I went through that merger, yes.
Yeah, so that was probably a big thing. But when you look back on that 25-ish year stretch, tell me, what were some of the big lessons? I mean, whether monetary policy or economic policy, culture that you learned. I mean, obviously there's more than a 20-minute segment of a podcast can handle for that at a lessons.
Right,
But
right.
what sticks in your mind today? Like, obviously pieces of that are probably more top of mind than others. But what's a great story from that time and something really impactful that would help others by hearing it?
Well, when I first joined JP Morgan, one of the things that came was a lot of doors get opened up. I was asked to join a group sponsored by the American Bankers Association, where they pick a handful of economists, and you get to go to the Federal Reserve every year and brief the chairman of the Fed in an off-the-record session, along with the entire board of governors, which I did for 2 years. So I remember briefing Alan Greenspan and talking to him about some research I was working on with regard to productivity growth and explaining how productivity growth interacts with monetary policy. And I remember just addressing and seeing Alan Greenspan's facial features and being fascinated and asking me all these questions. And I remember going back to the hotel after that, and I was pretty emotional, even though I had, you might say, accomplished a few things. I was pretty emotional that here's this kid that grew up in the inner cities, in the ghetto, you could say, and here he is basically discussing his research with the number one economist that I perceived in the entire United States with the most power, mainly the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and him asking me questions and saying that's pretty interesting, and trying to figure out how he could sort of build that into the way monetary policy is built. So it was a pretty emotional experience for me. And then, of course, other things along the way was really speaking, whether it was when I was a university professor where I really got to learn public speaking. I got to talk in large lecture halls, 500, 600 people. But after joining JP Morgan, I spoke in front of crowds as small as 200 people and as large as 2,000 people. I spoke in really all parts of the world. I got to do presentations for almost every central bank in Latin America, a few in Europe, several, including in Asia, including the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, the Bank of Korea, and others. That to me was a real privilege for me to be able to do that, because it was really my goal to be able to share some of the things that I have learned, whether in regard to research or observations that I have made with others. And then, of course, during my tenure with JP Morgan, another thing that I got to do, which I really enjoyed, was to do a lot of not only public speaking, but do a lot of television. During the 25 years that I was with JP Morgan, our marketing group counted that I did over 650 live television interviews with CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg Television, Reuters, and others, other media, even Chinese television.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty exciting, because remember, all these television interviews, they don't tell you what they're going to ask. It's live. And so you really have to be at the edge of your seat. And people say, oh, you can make a mistake. And I said, you can, but they just don't invite you back again. And so I worked really, really hard to prepare for those. In fact, the average time of preparation for every 3 or 4 or 5 minute interview is about 10 hours. That just shows you that before you go on, because they could ask you almost anything, you want to make sure that you're up to speed on almost everything that is going on. And not to say that you're never going to feel a little soft or something, but you don't ever want to be caught off guard. And that was the same thing with regard to the presentations I did for JP Morgan. A lot of audiences that I went to, when I got there, people would say, oh, are you nervous in the sense that, do you want us to tell you what people are going to ask? Are there questions you won't take? And I said, no, I take any question, because on television, people don't ask for permission to ask me a question. They're live. And so this is the best preparation I can. I think of it as sparring. A boxer, he prepares for it. And so all these presentations were preparation. I'm very proud of the fact that in the 25 years I was with JP Morgan, there was not one person on JP Morgan that can say that there was one question that I was asked by anybody in any presentation that I did that I didn't have an answer for. And I did about 10 live presentations a week over a 25-year period.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think you told me before too, you got really good at, as your boxer analogy, right? The bobbing and weaving the questions too, when they want you to take a position and almost put those words in your mouth on TV, right? They get pretty good at that too. And so you got very adept at that.
I get very adept because, as you probably know, all the media, they all have their slants. CNN has a slant. MSNBC has a slant. Fox Business News has a slant. But one of the things that I'm very proud of is that no matter which media outlet I go on, my comments are always unbiased. And I don't take any sides, whether it's a Democratic side, Republican side. I basically treat everyone like an adult. The audience is an adult, and I just provide the facts, and I give things that support the left, things that support the right. But at the end of the day, my comments are right down the middle. And I think that those are the kind of comments that my audience has always appreciated, because they can never say, oh, we're going to listen to this guy and we know exactly what his views are even before he starts talking. No, there are no views. There are only facts. You make the decision as to how to use those facts to make your own decision. And it's not my job to help you think, because everybody's an adult. So it is not my job to influence your thinking. My job is to provide the information so that you can make an informed decision on your own.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear, and this might have been a more challenging time. I'd love to hear about that too. I mean, what was it like being the kind of chief economist during the financial crisis? I mean, what was that time period like, right? Kind of from your perspective, like what were you, kind of charged with or running with during that time period?
Well, Jimmy, it was a very challenging time. I sat on the investment policy committee, which basically makes a lot of the investment decisions on how to make construct a portfolio. And we would meet about once a week. But during the financial crisis, that accelerated to once a day. And then later on, it accelerated to sometimes several times a day. So it was a real challenge. You have to completely stay on top of everything that was going on. Everything was very fluid. Everyone was at the highest state of alert. Because we were entering territory that many of us had not seen during our entire lifetime. So it was a very, very exhausting, but also very interesting experience for me. And so that when people tell me, well, are you worried about a market correction where the market could drop by 10%? I said, I think I'm not worried, because I've lived through a bigger correction than that. And during the global financial crisis, we dropped 56%. And of course, during this recent COVID crisis, we also dropped quite sharply. So I've lived through many of these experiences. And I like to say that whether you add the number of years that I've been on Wall Street or at the Federal Reserve or working as a economic researcher, I bring to the table almost 40 years of experience. And so that's one of the things that I think people find fascinating, that when they ask a question, I'm able to give them an example of something that happened throughout history. And again, I've always been a student of history, so I don't just give examples about what happened in the last 40 years. I like to give examples all the way back to the Panic of 1907, or whether it's 1929, or why somehow we slipped back into recession after the economy seemed to pick up after 1929. And then it wasn't until 1936 and 37 that, again, we slipped again. Why did that happen? And again, what are the analogies to what we're doing today? To give you one snippet, in 1936 to 37, we basically doubled reserve requirements. And that was a big, big mistake, because we just tight monetary policy so tight, thinking that everything was well. And that's one of the reasons why I think today our monetary theorists, or certainly our monetary policymakers, are so careful. And people say, oh, they're so cautious they can make mistakes. No, I think they're cautious because they know they've made mistakes before, and they got to make sure that those mistakes are not repeated again. And I think that's the lesson that history gives us. And that's one of the things my father always said while he was alive. He said, you have to make sure that you accept the fact that you can make mistakes. What you shouldn't accept is making the same mistake twice.
Yeah. I love that. what is I guess building off of that, current policy out there today, and it doesn't have to be exactly today, but kind of current-ish policy. Is there something that you're very impressed by? And then one thing that you would change if you had the magic wand and say, hey, here's a policy thing I don't think we're doing right, or just haven't started yet, right? Because sometimes stuff you've changed just isn't being done.
Well, I give great kudos to the Federal Reserve, and not just because I was there, but because I think they've managed through this COVID crisis quite well. But having said that, I think that right now the economy is doing a little bit better, even though I see the economy slowing down next year. I see some inflationary pressures. The Federal Reserve continues to buy $120 billion worth of bonds every single month. A lion's share of that, of course, is Treasury securities, and then a small sliver of that is mortgage-backed securities. But again, with the housing market doing so well, my suspicion is that it's okay to take back some of that stimulus from the housing market and start what they call tapering, which means buying less of those bonds every single month. And by the way, if it turns out to be a mistake, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, we made a mistake, we're going to start buying them again. But again, pulling back some of that, I think, would be a good idea. I think the Federal Reserve is talking about it. They haven't acted. But again, I don't blame them for not acting because, again, they had the prior experience of the last time where the financial markets went into what was called a taper tantrum and interest rates surged. And of course, there was financial conditions got tightened. So I think that if I was at the Federal Reserve today, I would say, look, we realized that maybe we were too aggressive the last time when we started pulling back. So we're going to gingerly pull back, but we will keep our options open that if somehow it's a mistake and we're just human, we will go back and start buying those securities again. But at the same time, when you see that housing prices are rising almost by 20%, when you look at Case-Shiller, on a year-over-year basis, almost 15 to 20% rising, or whether you look at the FHA numbers, it tells me that somehow we can, in fact, pull back a little bit on the housing front because the economy is growing and it's growing quite well. But that's not necessarily a decision that you have to make and commit yourself to not reverse if it's a mistake. Because, again, that's part of what comes with maturity, that when you make a decision, if you realize it's a mistake, you can change your mind. Or as John Maynard Keynes once famously said, he was delivering a speech, and this young lady came up to him and he said, I don't think you're pretty smart. He said, why not? He said, because you delivered a speech last year and you said something completely different from what you're saying now. And he said, with all due respect, ma'am, when the facts change, I change my opinion. What do you do? So again, I reserve the fact, and so should the Fed reserve the fact to reverse their decisions if it turned out to be a mistake.
Yep. I do always like I tell people that too, right? I always reserve the right to get smarter over time. And so if my decision, yeah, if it needs to change, it needs to change. I love that. So a couple other things. One, we can't go through this whole thing and be remiss to mention our friend Jack Campbell that you met at JPMorgan Chase and who introduced us too. So at least give a shout out to Jack. And how did you two get connected? I mean, was it from some of the leadership stuff that was going on there, or when did you guys cross paths?
Well, Jack Campbell, she is an amazing young lady. I've known her for over 20 years. I did a lot of events for her clients, where I spoke in group sizes of anywhere from 200 to 400 people. She would always call me first whenever she had an event and she needed a speaker. And one of the things she really loved is that she said, I have the ability to take a very complicated subject and basically bring it down to the client's a level and understanding without insulting anybody. And people walked away and they say, wow, couldn't somebody have explained that in the same way? And she said that was fascinating to her. And I said, well, one of the reasons I've done that is because as I graduated and entered my profession, my parents, my mother, who's still alive and was alive and passed away at the ripe age of 94, I would always explain to her what economics was all about. And I would always say, if I can't explain it to my mother, who only had a third grade education, then that theory is not all that great. And so, again, I'm going to explain it to people at client events, perhaps at a college level or a high school level, depending on what the intellectual capacity of that audience is. But again, to try to take something at the PhD level and bring it down to say at an undergraduate level and people can walk away with a keen understanding is one of the things that I pride myself on. And that was something that Jacqueline really appreciated. And therefore, I probably did maybe 80 or 90 presentation events for her during my career with JPMorgan.
Yeah, I mean that becomes more and more challenging as you kind of gather more and more information. It's something I've seen a lot, right? Taking the complex, making it simple. But you do see a lot of the academic world, right? As they spend 30, 40 years doing research, you get too much information there and it gets harder and harder, right? To piece it and bring it down to a simple explanation. So it's kudos for you on the ability to do that. So I'll kind of shift into the next piece, which is, well, you mentioned at least one thing before, I think Skyhook. And, what are you involved with now from a passion standpoint, nonprofit, legacy standpoint? Just love to see, obviously you retired, but I know you're still going on TV regularly. You sent me the Fox one earlier today, so you're still staying very active out there. But what's kind of next for you? Is it the working with the nonprofits, and what's on your mind today?
Well, Jamie, I continue to do a lot of public speaking. I have a whole bunch, numerous in-person public speaking events between now and the end of the year. Most of my events have been virtual, like this one, because of the pandemic, but I continue to do several public speaking engagements for profit during the year and per week. I do several of them per week. But what my real passion is to try to give back to society, and for that reason, I've been working very closely with the Skyhook Foundation on a pro bono basis to basically talk to different corporations that are focused on trying to help give disadvantaged individuals like myself when I was growing up the opportunity to turn things around. When you consider that the stem cell profession pays an average salary that is 3 to 4 times what a liberal arts degree in college graduate would earn, that's a great way to take these young kids in these neighborhoods and give them that opportunity. And one of the things, and we've done a lot of research on the Skyhook Foundation, is that if you expose these kids at the 3rd or 4th grade level, that's the right time to basically stimulate that activity. And if the people that stimulate that kind of activity look like the people that you're trying to influence, then you actually get an even better opportunity to accomplish something. And that's what the Skyhook Foundation does. And I think it's very, very exciting. And by the way, at an average cost of less than $400 per student, and here you're going to take a kid that is basically going to earn 3 to 4 times what the average liberal arts degree graduate in college will make. So if you want to close that income inequality gap, or as economists would like to say, shrink that Gini coefficient that actually measures the level of inequality in a given group or in the United States, that's what you have to do. Create opportunities for these individuals to make a lot more money, but do it in a credible fashion, because for these many of these kids, just like for myself, you don't always know whether it's possible. I was stubborn and I said, I'm going to make sure it's possible, but I can't tell you how many kids from the Skyhook Foundation that have signed up for the program have said, yeah, this is very fascinating, but can I really do it? And when they see that other people are mentoring them that look like them, then they say it is possible and they get excited about it. And if you don't get these students at the 3rd or 4th grade, it's going to be too late. They're going to be exposed to other things. And by the way, there's a lot of other professions. But one of the things that I grew up with when I was growing up, people said, well, I can be a baseball player. I can be a basketball player. And those things are great. But I think, Jamie, between you and I, we know that the odds are not necessarily in your favor. But if you try to succeed in a profession that you can go to college for and make a lot of money, and when I say that, I mean in relative terms, then I think
Yeah.
you have a better chance of succeeding. And so that's why I have such a passion for this Skyhope Foundation, because I think it gives a young kid growing up in a neighborhood like I grew up, with very few opportunities, and some might say with dreams that are often not realized, the opportunity to make it. And I think that when we do that for many kids, we're making a difference. And that's really what I want to do. So I do a lot of public speaking to pay my bills, but the Skyhope Foundation is basically to satisfy my heart and really to make a difference for my legacy. That's something that I love, and that's something that I think makes more of a difference. Because at the end of the day, after I pay my bills, there'll be another bill next month, but your legacy is forever.
Mm-hmm. I love the point about, exposing them and showing them the possibilities of a brighter future. And that exposure aspect is really important, so people have a belief that it can be them too, right? I mean, because a lot of people, they don't get exposed to that. They don't see somebody else like you who's come from a similar area and had success. And sports is always tough, right? I mean, sports does provide a lot of people with opportunity. One of the challenges I always have with sports, and I could be completely wrong on this since I don't have research on both sides suggesting it, but what I've been around a lot of great athletes. Kareem would be a great example of this. No matter how hard I try, I can't be Kareem, right? There's a there's a physicality aspect of sports that talent does come into play a lot, right? And I grew up swimming with Michael Phelps, and same thing, right? Like, we had a lot of people that did the exact same practices, but only one of them went on to be the all-time gold medal holder. But I think in kind of the work world, effort, dedication can take you further than just effort and dedication can in kind of the sports arena. So to some degree, I always feel that you have a little bit more control over the ultimate outcome than you do in a sports world, where there's, talent, size, all of that comes into play a little bit more, but obviously does give a lot of people opportunity. If you could wrap up, so with legacy, I love how you kind of brought us back to that piece. If there was a phrase or term or something that you said, if I was gone tomorrow and everyone looked back and they would view this about me, what would you like that to be?
I guess my legacy that I give a lot of young kids, especially kids that are just starting out, is not just to say never give up, because that's an easy cliche. Is to never give up your dream, because you are the only one that has the power to make your dream a reality. So my advice to kids is never give up your dream, and do whatever you can to make that dream a reality, because nobody else is going to do it for you. Yes, you can get mentors that can actually help, but ultimately you are the driver of that dream. And then the mentors will come and the opportunities will come. But if you don't have that drive to realize your dream, it just won't happen. So never give up your dream.
Hey, that is a strong close. I think we think about that a lot, but hearing it out loud is a beautiful thing. I even got some shivers on my own arms, right? The never give up on your dream, and love it. That best ways for people to follow you or connect with you. I know you're active on LinkedIn. Is that kind of the best place for you nowadays?
Yes, I'm active on LinkedIn. I post a lot of the research that I do. I'm also somewhat active on Twitter. And of course, I continue to do a lot of public speaking all over the United States. I still travel internationally. Right before COVID, I was a keynote speaker at a Chinese IPO conference in Shenzhen, and we'll be doing that again once the international channels open up again. So I've gotten some requests to do some presentations in Latin America, and again, they've been postponed because of COVID. So there'll be a lot of opportunities out there to hear me, and I hope some of you will tune in to listen, whether it be on some of the media outlets or some of the venues that I'll be speaking at.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Anthony Chan, I love this. This was fantastic. And I just want to take the time and make sure I always do this right. Thanks for your impact out there. Obviously, you've had a tremendous impact, and thank you for your time here, your knowledge, the impact you're making on society. And I do appreciate, this is a just the time you take to spend with me here too. And as you mentioned, events, I know we're hopeful to get you out to one of our big events next year. And that's about 1,500 people. So we got to get you in front of some big groups out there. It's the goal. So you've got the right message for everyone. So again, thanks so much, and everyone else for joining and listening this week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Framework Podcast.